who is an associate professor of organizational behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and, by courtesy, of sociology. He is also the co-director of the Computational Culture Lab. He was a computer science major in college, and he moved on to work as an IT consultant before getting a PhD in sociology at Princeton. So given his background, he constantly searches for and develops new computational methods for modeling dynamic social processes. His work uses NLP and network-based methods applied to big data to create analytics of culture and to understand relationality, differentiations, and boundaries. Personally, I particularly like his recent works on how prescient ideas emerge and his recent annual review article on sociology of interpretation. Today, he will deliver a talk titled Locally Ensconced and Globally Integrated, How Positions in Network Structure Relate to a Language-Based Model of Group Identification. So let's welcome Professor Goldberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm glad to discover that someone read the recent paper on the sociology of interpretation. So that is exciting. I'm glad you read it. Thank you for doing that, and thank you for inviting me and for taking the time to introduce me. And I just want to add that so it's evening here in my office at Stanford, and I see only your names. So you should feel free to ask me questions as we go along. Especially if these are clarification questions, but even if they're not technically clarification questions, if you think that these are theoretical questions that you would really like to address, that you think it would make sense to address at the moment, I always prefer having a conversation rather than having a very formal presentation followed by a Q&A session. So you can either raise your hand or you can write it in the chat, and if I don't notice it, you will alert me. So please free to do so. Let me share my screen with you. Yes, this brings post-traumatic memories of Zoom teaching. So I didn't know this still happens. I recently got COVID, and in the last class of the quarter, this recent quarter, I had to teach on Zoom, which only reminded me how much I enjoy interacting with other people in person. This technology is still not ripe for solving all our problems. But anyway, this is work that is titled Locally Ensconced by Globally Integrated Language, Network Position, and the Personal Dynamics of Organizational Identity. Now, you could imagine that I could have worded or titled this presentation a little bit different. I could have been far more to the point, stating that this is a language-based model of organizational identification, demonstrating how network position relates to identification strength. This would have given you a very clear idea about what it is that I'm going to present in this talk, but it would also give you a lot of corollary information about my identity, about who I am, my kind of scientific commitments, my empiricism. Now imagine in contrast that I would have named it or titled it a little bit differently. I would use a more kind of playful way of deconstructing reality. Note that in all of these cases, I am trying to communicate the same kind of informative data about what it is that I'm about to present, but I package it stylistically, semantically in very different ways, and that communicates a lot of kind of associated connotative information about who I am, about my commitments as a scientist, about my theoretical orientations, etc. And really, this is the kind of meat of what I've been going to be doing and what I have been doing at the Computational Culture Lab for quite a few years now. It's really the intuition that language as the most prominent medium of communication that humans have is really also the mechanism and the channel through which culture and cultural material is shared, is negotiated, is interpersonally transmitted. And really, the vast majority of my work over the last decade now has used natural language processing methods to try and unpack this nebulous thing that we call culture. It's really been exciting because over the last 10 years, the amount of developments have been dazzling. So what I'm going to actually show you right now, in terms of NLP technology, is almost prehistoric at this stage. It's very 2018, and because of how the pace of technology is developing, it might seem almost outmoded. But I always prefer taking a conservative approach and trying to achieve the same thing with less sophisticated technology, because that, I think, gives me a little bit more traction about what it is that I'm doing. You could imagine that what we're going to do, what I'm going to show you today, could have been achieved using large language models, but I won't be using large language models. This is really all work that I've been doing together collaboratively with members of the Computational Culture Lab. So these are some of the great students that I've had the pleasure of working with, or that I am currently working with. Some of them have just started jobs, like Abe Oshotze and Austin Van Loon. And specifically, the study today has been spearheaded by Lara Yang, who just graduated, sorry, this Sunday, and with my colleague Samir Srivastava at Berkeley, who's my friend and also co-founder and co-director of the Computational Culture Lab. So the topic that I want to talk to you about today is the question of identity, which is really a fundamental concept in sociology and social psychology. It always astonishes me, those of you who have been on an American campus, the extent to which, for example, people are willing or are invested in their identity as graduates of Stanford University. We just saw this here over commencement weekend this last weekend, but the amount of money and time that people are willing to invest in order to come over here for reunions and to communicate to one another that they are members of the Stanford community. Of course, it communicates a lot of status and information, but people are heavily committed to it. But identity, as I'm sure you all know, is a very broad, encompassing social phenomenon. I'm always perplexed by how people are willing to shout and get ecstatic about a bunch of men who are overpaid and that don't know that they are running after a ball. But even beyond sports and universities, the problem, the kind of sociological problem around identity has been structuring a lot of sources of friction in contemporary industrialized and democratized economies. So, for example, the erosion of democracy and issues around political polarization are very strongly rooted in identity, whether in the United States, whether in Europe. Just recently, elections in Europe in the Parliament, in the European Parliament, have brought up a huge a soaring of identitarian, populist, right-wing parties. And really, identity at the extreme can lead people to make significant sacrifices. People, for the sake of the abstract group to which they belong, are often willing to make even the most ultimate sacrifices. So clearly, identity is a broad and important sociological construct that has implications in broad settings, from recreation to politics to war. And the question that many have focused on is the question of where does identity come from? And that is not something that we're going to touch on today. Rather, the question that we're really interested in is the question of identification strength. So given that you are a nominal member of a group, what explains the degree to which one defines oneself as a member of that given social group? So even amongst Americans, amongst Liverpool soccer fans, amongst Republicans, amongst Europeans. There are varying degrees to which people identify with that group and define themselves as members of that group. And that is what, kind of following the literature, we define as identification strengths. And specifically, we're going to focus our question in the context of organizations. Later on, I will try to make certain generalizations beyond organizations, but from this moment on, when I'm going to talk about identification, I'm going to talk about specifically organizational identification and the question of organizational identification strength, namely, what explains variance in people's tendency to self-define as members of the organization, given that they are nominally members of the organization, given that they are employed by that organization. Why should we care about this? So I think, the reason I show this especially when I talk to economists or strategy people, there's often kind of the question of how is identification strength related to outcomes in organizations? So there's actually quite a lot of literature suggesting that strong organizational identification is associated with mostly positive outcomes. Employees with higher identification are more psychologically rewarded by their jobs. They tend to invest more. They tend to increase their performance. So this is definitely a boon from the point of view of the organization, because employers can reap performance rewards from employees with high organizational identification. There are also downsides. There's research about the dark side of identification, the cultish, the burnout aspects. I don't want to dismiss those, but overall, there's a clear positive relationship between strength of identification and performance at the individual and the organizational level. So this is something that is immensely consequential for the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations as a whole, sorry. And generally, in answering the question of what explains variance in the strength of identification across people, there have been, broadly speaking, two types of explanations. The first explanation, which I will refer to as the between-firm explanation, argues that it's simply the case that some firms are better, whether actively or implicitly, in generating stronger identification. This could be because they're more successful. We know that people want to identify, to have like a positive self-concept, and therefore they identify with more successful organizations, those that are higher status. Maybe Stanford could be an example of that. Organizations that are good at cultivating strong cultures, that have a sense of purpose. So there are a variety of reasons, but here the explanation is that what explains a difference in organizational strength, identification strength, is differences between organizations. But of course, that does not explain differences between people inside the same organization. You might argue that, think about Facebook, for example. It was a very celebrated company in its early days. Then there were a lot of scandals associated with it. So you might assume that as a consequence, people's strength of identification with Facebook had declined, but that would not explain differences between people contemporaneously. At most, it would explain people within person differences across time because of changes in the organization. So what really explains, like, holding the organization constant, differences between people? And herein come another set of explanations, what I call the between person explanations, that simply some people are more or less likely to identify with their organization because of their personality or their socio-demographic background. I love this quote, which somebody told me is actually misattributed to Groucho Marx, which famously said that I don't want to belong to any club that will accept me as a member. So he's like the classical misanthrope who would never identify. There are other types of explanations. So, for example, which would relate more to sociodemographics. People find it more difficult to identify within an organization in which they are the demographic minority. I used to be at Notre Dame University, which is a Catholic university. I'm Jewish. I can see those explanations. It becomes more difficult if you're nominally different on a sociodemographic dimension. But here, once again, I'm not dismissing these explanations, not at all. But this kind of assumes fixed traits at the individual level, and that does not explain differences within people over time, holding the organization constant. So our purpose here is not to dismiss any of these. We definitely believe that there are between firm and between fixed between people explanations that explain, or differences that explain variance in organizational strength. But being a sociologist, I have to pay homage to a dead European sociologist from the early 20th century. In this case, it will be Georg Simmel. And really the set of kind of theoretical explanations we're going to build on is Simmel's idea of how one's position in the network affects or relates to their sense of identification, and specifically the idea of triadic closure, that once you are ensconced or tightly knit in a set of relationships where your friends are also friends with one another, that increases your sense of identification. And in fact, we're going to make two broad arguments that may seem at first sight as suggesting opposite trends. We argue that identification grows both with local network cohesion in a very Simmelian sense, but also with global network integration. And let me explain what I mean by these two. Oops, sorry. So by local cohesion, we mean network closure, the tendency of having your alters in a network also being connected to one another. There's been a lot of theoretical argumentation suggesting the relationship between network closure and strength of identification. But actually, there's been very little empirical work demonstrating that. There's actually been not a lot of work even making directly the connection to identification per se. But the arguments are as following. There's the whole kind of Coleman approach, which says if I'm friends with John and David are also friends with one another, if I behave inappropriately with John, David will become aware of that. That's a way to kind of control my behavior, but that also creates a sense of commitment, a sense of belongingness. I can have more trustful relationships. And kind of the secondary effect of that is having a strong sense of identity. There's a work by Krackhart on the ties that torture. He kind of shows that people who are members of groups where their friends are not friends with one another, they're kind of in an identity crisis. They don't know whom they belong to. They are not trusted by their peers, and as a consequence, they don't have a sense of identification with the overarching group. So there's been a lot of argumentation that suggests that there should be a relationship between cohesion and identification. But if you scan the literature, very, very limited empirical evidence. One of the studies I really like is a study now 20 years old by Bierman and Moody. They show, for example, that suicidal ideation is negatively related with network closure. And their argument is that students find it difficult to identify with their peers, with the school, and that is correlated with their tendency to express suicidal thoughts. But again, this is not specifically about identification, definitely not in the organizational context. We also introduce another argument, which to my knowledge has not been really studied or even argued in the literature, which is that, especially in the context of an organization, it's not enough to be part of a cohesive network position, but it's also important to have connections beyond one's local context, because that provides access to information and creates a sense of integration. So for example, for me here at the business school, I'm part of a tight-knit group in the organizational behavior group, but it's also important for me to have a few relationships with other people at the business school, or even in other departments in the university, in the history department, in chemistry, that creates a broader sense of identification of this big ship called Stanford above and beyond the immediate context in which I'm embedded. Now, I kind of suggested these as two seemingly opposite trends in the sense that one is about local cohesion and the other one is about a kind of global, spreading your global tentacles. But I think we kind of hypothesize these as being additive effects. They're not in any way mutually exclusive. In an organizational setting, it's important both to be part of a tight-knit community and to have relationships that go beyond this. So what does this look like in terms of operationalization conceptually and as construed as hypotheses? So our first hypothesis is that organizational identification should increase with local clustering. This is how we operationalize Zemelian ties and being part of a tight-knit community. The idea here is I is the focal actor. These numbered edges, nodes represents I's colleagues in the organization. The more that I's colleagues are connected to one another, as you see in diagram A, the more I's sense of identification, whereas diagram on the C, where I's friends are not communicating with one another, this would be a very low clustering coefficient, in fact, a zero clustering coefficient, and this person should have a low sense of identification with their organization. So the operationalization is very simple. It's the sparsity or density of the realization of all ties between I's friends, which is known as the clustering coefficient. The global reach argument is our second hypothesis, which is that organizational identification strength should increase with global reach. So imagine the node here in the center. Excuse me. I'm colorblind, but I believe that these are the kind of yellow or green nodes. So imagine that this is an overview of the whole network of interactions in an organization, and we've identified different clusters. And I'll show you how we do that technically, but the idea here is that we kind of inductively identify the structure of communities inside the organization. So if this were Stanford, the red here might be the engineering school, the blue here might be the medical school, the yellow might be the GSB, the Graduate School of Business. And what we argue is that the more a member of the green-yellow group also has connections in the red, blue, and other groups, the more they're integrated into the organization, more broadly speaking, and that should be positively correlated with their sense of identification. Now, note that I've specifically now stated my hypothesis as a correlational hypothesis. I'm not going to be able to demonstrate to you causality. This is my imagery of when I present in business school, there's always somebody in what I call the indigeneity police who's going to arrest me for not well identified. So I kind of accept defeat a priori. In fact, I believe that there is reverse causality. I believe that strong identifiers select into network positions of global and reach and closure, probably to the same extent as occupying this position also induces them to increase their strength of the identification. We're not going to be able to unpack that. We're going to show you a few lagged models that at least will temporally suggest that network position precedes identification, but I'm not going to make a strong causal argument here. This is really a correlational study. And with that kind of out of the way, the main issue here is that testing these hypotheses is methodologically very, very challenging because we need to measure all of these network and identification measures at scale, at a high granularity over time, because we want to measure them as people change during their tenure in the organization. And that's difficult, and it's especially difficult on the identification side because traditional measures of kind of old-fashioned measures of identification have tended to rely on self-reports. And I don't mean to dismiss self-reports, and I've used them, and I'm going to use them in this study as well. But as you all know, self-reports, aside from having desirability bias and self-awareness bias, they also have low granularity. It's very difficult to ask people how much do you identify with your organization on a daily or even weekly basis. Also, when you administer this, people, if they're concerned that their answers are somehow going to affect their fate in the organization, they might try to present themselves as stronger identifiers. Sometimes even for the purpose of your own self-concept, you might even be willing to lie to yourself. So there are significant challenges with measuring identification using survey measures. The most common measure is known as the Malin-Ashworth measure. This is a 6 kind of component measure that you can see the various questions that are being asked. I want to point you to sentence number 3. When I talk about my employer, I usually say we rather than them or they, which is an intuition that we're going to use in our measure. But this is the common way of measuring identification in the organizational behavior literature. A second measure that's also fairly common is the Bergami et al. Measure, where people ask, they say, you know, one of these circles in each row represents you, the other represents the organization. And this kind of metaphorical visualization, where are you? At the A end or at the H end? Are these 2 circles really overlapping, or are they far apart? And this is a visual way of representing your sense of identification. As you will see, we find that these measures are only weakly correlated with one another. So that tells us that these are operationalizations that suffer from different types of problems and maybe measuring slightly different types of constructs. Identification is a complex construct. There are also behavioral measures in the spirit of revealed preferences in economics. Some have operationalized identification behaviorally as the extent to which the individual is willing to make a sacrifice. So, for example, people who donate to their alma mater identify with their college. But in an organizational context, it's very difficult to observe sacrifices that are not induced by other factors. So, for example, if I come to work late, is it because I identify with the organization, or is it because I have a really strict boss? It's difficult to separate. None of these are perfect measure. Neither is the measure that I'm going to introduce to you. But I'm going to introduce to you a different way of measuring it that might overcome some of these challenges. Our approach, as you may have anticipated by my preamble, is to use language as it naturally occurs in organizational life and develop a language model of identification. And here is our approach. We use language as a behavioral reflection of the strength of identification by looking at the semantic distance between only 2 pronouns, I and we. I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that. But we operationalize the strength of identification as a semantic similarity between the pronouns I and we in naturally occurring text. So when a speaker speaks, we kind of position their words I and we in semantic space, and the closer they are in semantic space, the more we infer that this person identifies with the organization, that her construal of the self is similar to her construal of the group, which implies that she identifies with the organization, that her self-concept is coterminous with the group. Let me explain how we do this. We use a technology known as word embedding models. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not. Let me give you an intuitive understanding of what this means. This was introduced a decade ago, and it builds on the kind of idea that introduced by the English linguist first century ago, that you can know the meaning of the word by the company it keeps. So take a look at this sentence. We took our to the veterinarian. What is the mask word here? Simply through the context in which it is enunciated, you can probably infer that it's likely to be pet and not grandfather, or couch, or car, or abstract, pain. But the intuition here is clear. And what word embedding models do is that they train a model, they feed it with a lot of information, and they ask it to predict what is a mass word in light of the few words preceding and following it. And what happens is that then each word is located in a lower dimensional embedding space. So think, the implication would be that the model, when the word I or the word we are masked, it learns to position it in this lower dimensional embedding space. And the more the speaker uses the words I and we in a way that makes the model think that they're interchangeable, the more they're semantically similar, and hence the more we conclude that the person is identifying with the group. So the way that people have used the word embeddings is that the distance between words in the embedding space corresponds to the subjective semantic representation of these words. So usually these are high dimensional spaces, 300 dimensions. Here I'm just kind of illustrating this to you with a lower dimensional space, a two-dimensional space. But the idea would be that France and Italy are far closer in embedding space, because these are both names of countries, than the nouns ball and crocodile. And that has been demonstrated in many, many contexts. And the way to measure this distance, the common kind of way of doing this is using the cosine similarity or cosine distance. And we're kind of using the state-of-the-art approach and using word embeddings and measuring semantic similarity as the cosine distance between two words, in our case, I and we. So for example, people have demonstrated, this is my colleagues here in computer science at Stanford, have demonstrated that this can capture a lot of like implicit connotations. They've analyzed the Google Books corpus and have demonstrated that there's a strong relationship with the gendered composition of an occupation and how close it is in space to words that represent femininity and masculinity. So words like nurse and librarian, that especially in the Anglo-Saxon context are very feminized occupations, actually are closer in embedding space to the word woman, female, than they are to the word male, man. So that shows you how very kind of implicit connotations are captured by these word embedding models. And that is precisely the feature of word embeddings that we're going to exploit. But, and this is a big but, GloVe and every other word embedding models assumes a language model that's shared by all speakers. So what happens is that GloVe is being fed millions and millions of documents, and it learns the meaning of the word librarian or I or we, but it has no idea who wrote those documents and assumes that all of the speakers have the same language model. But what we want to do is to compare differences between people or even within the same person over time. So what we need to do is to actually adjust the GloVe model to individual speakers separately. And to do that, we use something known as Mittens, which was developed here by Chris Potts and his colleagues. Chris Potts and I have had the pleasure of collaborating on a few projects a few years ago. And Mittens is simply kind of builds on the GloVe model. It takes a pre-trained GloVe model that represents contemporary American spoken English and is then fine-tuned on a subcorpus that represents, in our case, an individual speaker, and adjusts the locations of words in embedding space to that speaker's language. The idea here is that we don't need to learn from scratch the meanings of the word table or computer, because those are, broadly speaking, shared across speakers. We want to learn whether, by fine-tuning, kind of conditional on all of these being English speakers, do they still use specific words in ways that are significantly different from one another? And our focus is going to be the pronouns I and we. So we train using Mittens, we fit, sorry, the GloVe model to each speaker individually. So really, all of this is to conclude with our measure, which is the embedding distance between I and we as a measure of organizational identification. So how do we do this? We get the pre-trained glove embedding, which represents contemporary spoken American English. We fine-tune it on all the emails. I forgot to mention this. I will be applying this to email communication inside an organization. I apologize, I forgot to have a slide on this, but this is the form of communication that we're going to use. So we'll fine-tune this on all the emails within a company to kind of adjust the language to particular kind of lingo, the name of the firm, name of customers and others that might appear. We then, using mittens, so we get company-specific word embeddings. We then fine-tune those on emails that are sent by each individual, and we get person-specific embeddings. And in order for us to be able to observe changes within person over time, we use mittens to fine-tune at the person quarter level. So quarter is a 3-month period. And as a consequence, we get person quarter specific embeddings, which allows us to observe changes within person over time, with the unit of analysis being the person quarter. And we use the cosine similarity between I and we to evaluate the level of identification that that person has with the organization during that given quarter. So this is the method that we use in order to create our measure of identification. Note how we take this huge unstructured language, we reduce it in a very brute force ways using these word embeddings, and at the end of the day, we only look at 2 words. But as I'll show you in a moment, we extract a lot of information from doing that. So are there any questions about the methodology before I show you some validation and then I can show you the results? Yes.
Amir, yes.
Eric,
first of all,
ahead.
I find this fascinating. So one question I have, and maybe this would come out later, but when you're looking at the individual and whether they're using we versus I, are you also sort of calibrating that according to whom I'm writing to?
No.
Okay, so that was one part of it, right? And the other was, I just have a kind of silly comment, but it seems like the glove and mitten, I like the use of that, but I realize in a way, glove has the individual sort of fingers, digits articulated, and so it should be the other way around in a way. But anyway, that's just silly.
Agreed. So the metaphor here actually invokes the exact opposite. I agree with
right.
you.
But just them all together, right?
To double click on your first question, the short answer is no. However, if the identity of the interlocutor is somehow manifest in the language, so if I say to you, hi, Eric, yeah, and everybody knows Eric in the organization, and I fine-tune, so the word embedding model implicitly learns that I'm speaking to Eric. So this is not explicitly built into the model, and we're not in any way kind of informing the as we train and fine-tune the model who the speaker is, but a lot of the time the identity of the speaker can leak, so to speak, and that's a feature. It's not a bug, in the sense that if there are prominent speakers who I mean, it would be useful if I speak to the CEO, that the model implicitly knows that I'm speaking to the CEO.
Right.
But here we rely heavily on the beauty of the model, which and that also alludes to another issue, which is we need a lot of data here. We need a lot of data to train. You need to sample a lot of information, which is why the quarter person unit is really the minimal amount of time that we can train, and we also limit it to people who I believe send at least 50 emails. Anything lower than that just introduces too much noise. Ideally, you would want to have more, but those are great questions. Are there any other questions about the methodology before I move on?
Just about Emma, this is Tony.
Yes.
Can you clarify a little bit more about the feasibility of taking into account who is being written tool, that is a speaking tool, target the recipient of the email technically in your data, can you identify it as a
Yeah,
medical
so we
fact?
can identify. We can
Just that
identify.
the modeling, training of the data does not take that explicitly into account.
Right, it doesn't take that
Okay.
into account. You know,
Uh-huh.
you can there if I wanted to do this, I could do it, but I actually have strong reasons why I wouldn't do it. But
Mhm.
you know, you could there's something known as doc to vec. So in doc to vec also introduces, in addition to the vector that represents the words, there's another cell that represents the document. And that can help you kind of locate the identity of the document. So you could do like a person to vec if you were so inclined.
Mhm.
But what that would tell me is that would force the model to adjust. That would be useful if I wanted to know if on average different people, whether as recipients of messages or as the origins of messages, talk about semantically different things. But that's not the purpose of my exercise here. So like I think what I would want to know is, why is it important for me to know who the recipient is and how should I include them in the model? I don't have a strong prior on that, and consequently, we did not include that. But from a simple technical perspective, one can include that in the model. That requires some modifications.
Okay, good enough. Thank you.
Excellent. These are excellent questions.
I also have a follow-up question on
Go
this
ahead.
size issue. So you mentioned that it needs a lot of data to train the model, which is also what I learned. But is there a standardized way to determine just how large the corpus size should be? Because I imagine it's like case by case. So different studies, they may need
Yeah.
different size of the corpus, right?
So there's no off-the-shelf answer to that question. But that's why using the pre-trained glove model is really important, because that reduces 95% of the knowledge, quote unquote, that the model needs to have about contemporary spoken English that's shared by all speakers, which I don't want it to learn. And actually, it's, in fact, when you start training on mittens, it's enough for the person to, the good news is people use pronouns like I and we quite a lot, relatively speaking. It's enough for them to have mentioned it in 4 and 5 emails for the model to start learning about it. So think about it. I speak English. You speak English. We understand. And imagine that you were talking to somebody and they were saying to you the following sentence. You know, I really did a good job this year. But as an organization, we really suck, okay? So you already kind of can infer simply by this that the word we and I are being construed differently, and probably this person doesn't strongly identify with the organization. But that required a lot of prior knowledge about the meanings, suck, and organization, etc. So the beauty here is that actually, if you've trained it on a very good pre-trained corpus, you don't need to fine-tune the data too much. The reason that we use 50 emails is that we want to kind of increase the likelihood that the person will have spoken at least several times, has mentioned pronouns, and that mention that it wasn't something like unique. Maybe when I talk to my CEO, I'm going to pretend that I identify, but when I talk to my peers, I'm going to be more authentic. So sampling here of a larger quantity gives us a lot of assurances, and we saw that above a certain threshold, actually, our models become very stable, and additional information doesn't really buy us more prediction power. These are great questions. Anyway, let me show you a little bit of how we validate the model, the measure, sorry. What we did first is we ran a survey. We used the two measures that I showed you, the Malin-Ashworth and the Bergami, and we correlated. We did that in one international staffing firm. We surveyed 1,400 people, and as you can see, right, the upper row represents our measure, and it is correlated with the Malin-Ashworth measure at 0.4. You might say, this is not very high correlation. It is measured, it correlates, we also see that it correlates with itself at 0.81 if you 1 year, if the data were collected 1 year apart, or at 0.67 if they're collected 2 years apart. So people change in their level of identification. But here's something interesting, which is that when we looked at the measure between the two established measures, Malin, Ashworth, and Bergami et al., their correlation, so Malin Ashworth's correlation with Bergami et al. Was comparable to its correlation with our measure. So the way I like to think about it, our measure is probably as shitty as the other measures, but its advantages is that we can do it at scale in a non-interventionist way, at very high granularity, in a way that none of these measures can be done. This just shows you some of the problem with self-reports, that people tend to kind of exaggerate their level of identification. So I'm interested, this whole study has kind of alerted me to the idea that identification is a kind of dimensional problem, and that all of these measures are in some way very reductive and only capture one dimension of it. But and this is one of the kind of points of evidence. But from now on, I'm kind of going to use this as at least this level of validation to say the quality of our measure in terms of inter-measure kind of validity is as good as inter-measure validity between other survey responses, but it has the advantages of having high granularity. And we apply this to data that we've collected from 3 different firms that have been kind enough to share their email exchange with us. The international staffing firm, which was also used for survey validation, a mid-sized technology firm, and a mid-sized design firm. These are the periods during which we collected the data. Overall, this gives us roughly 10,000 person quarter observations, which we also match with HR records such as demographics, role, tenure, etc. Here are a few kind of predictive validation results that you would predict should be correlated with identification strength. This is still not our main hypothesis, but kind of ways of validating our measure through its predictive analytics rather than through survey validation. So for example, one would expect that the stronger someone identifies with the organization, the less they are likely to exit the organization. So this is a simple Cox proportional hazard model of exit. And as you can see, where we control for department, company fixed effects, we also control for gender. So as you can see, our measure of co-similarity, these are odds ratios. So this, we should interpret this as a negative relationship. The stronger the similarity between I and we, the stronger our measure of identification, the smaller the likelihood of exit, or the risk of exit, as you would expect. We also measured effort, and here we measure effort as after-hours emailing. Now, earlier I complained about why this is not a perfect measure of revealed preferences, so take it with a pinch of salt. It doesn't necessarily represent effort, but it is a proxy for effort, and we have various models here where we measure this as simply your raw number of messages after work. We standardize it by your network peers or by your department. However we operationalize it, we see that there's a strong relationship between identification and the likelihood of emailing after hours. You might also note that women also have a strong negative correlation with this. So this would, to me, my interpretation is that women have, due to the gender division of labor in the household, women have more constraints for working after hours. So this is good indication of why this is not a perfect measure of effort. But even when we include individual fixed effects, so holding constant your position, your constraints at home, and other traits that are fixed, we still see that there's a positive correlation between the two, once again providing validation that identification relates to behavioral outcomes that you would assume are related to it. And we also find that it increases with tenure over time, whether we include or don't include person fixed effects. As people mature in the organization, they also identify with it as one would expect. So those are kind of the battery of measures that we've applied in order to test kind of the validity of our measure. So before I show you the main results, are there any questions on the validation exercise that I just showed you? Okay. So with that, let me show you our main results. Whoops. So let me translate our constructs that I defined earlier conceptually into operationalizations being measured using the email data that I have. So in order to produce our computational network measures, we're going to use metadata, namely information about who sends emails to whom as an implicit measure of relationships. And we use this to construct an email network. So here we basically create a directed network where an edge exists between employee I and J if I and I have exchanged an email in the focal quarter Q. And we can also have these as weighted measures, so it's not merely whether Tony and Eric exchange an email during this time. We can measure the number of emails and kind of use this as this weight as a proxy of the strength of their relationship. And we apply this to each firm independently, each of the three firms who've shared their data with us. So how do we measure this? So the clustering coefficient, we use simply a very kind of established way of measuring the weighted clustering coefficient, which is basically the multiplication of all triads in which individual U is embedded, and then kind of that to the power of 1/3, so taking kind of a third root of that and dividing it by the overall number of edges that each individual has. Note, some of you who are familiar with the sociological literature on network closure might think that the appropriate measure here would be Bert's measure of constraint. We don't think that that is the case because constraint is kind of like higher order, second level relationships. We're really interested in operationalizing the extent to which an individual's friends also interact with one another in a way that is visible to that individual, where they can subjectively kind of experience the sense that they're part of a tight-knit network. And we believe that the simple measure of clustering coefficient is the appropriate measure in this case. This has been established in the literature and has been used in many, many studies in network science. So this is our measure of clustering. And our measure of global reach, we use something known as the Louvain method, which is basically a community detection algorithm in networks. I won't get into the details of how it operates. There are a variety of network detection algorithms. This is generally agreed to be kind of the state of the art, especially in the application to email exchange. What it does is it identifies communities in the network, the blues and the reds and the yellows that we saw in the visualization earlier, and it assigns individual nodes to individual communities. So we use this off the shelf, and the way that we operationalize global reach is using the Herfindahl index, which is actually basically the Sampson diversity index, which basically measures the level of concentration of an individual's ties in their own community or in other communities. So the greater, we take the inverse of the Herfindahl index, which measures concentration, industrial concentration, but it's applied here to edges. The more edges are dispersed across communities, the greater their global reach. So this is a fairly simple operationalization. So these are the two ways by which we operationalize our measures. And what I'm going to show you is the two hypotheses and show to you both between person models and within-person models that include individual fixed effects, basically that explain away all fixed variation between individuals and really traces differences in the levels of identification as an individual changes their position in network over time in the same organization. So this is a simple between-person model where our measure of our organizational identification strength is the dependent variable, and the independent variables are network variables and other types of variables. We include tenure because, as you saw, and as you would imagine, people's strength of identification increases over time. We also include the number of tokens, which is simply the amount of words that were used in order to estimate the model and fine-tune it for each individual. The reason is that we want to make sure that our models are not just sensitive to the volume of language on which they are being estimated. And we also include the network size in this model because the local clustering kind of mechanically also varies with the network size. The larger the number of your interlocutors, the more it becomes unfeasible for all of them to know one another. So there's a mechanical relationship between, and we want to kind of see whether holding constant your node degree is local clustering changing with, is your sense of identification changing with local clustering? And as you can see, whether our measure is local clustering or global reach, both of them have very significant, and these are standardized coefficients. So also in terms of standardized effects, they're pretty sizable. And very interestingly, even in model 4 here, when we include them both as, in the same model, they remain equally significant and comparable in the size of the effect, which suggests to us that these are very additive effects. And it's not that they are somehow mutually exclusive or that we're measuring the same thing. We also include department controls and gender controls. We also include company by quarter fixed effects. So we want to make sure that any changes that are attributable to the organization, if Facebook suddenly goes through a scandal, we want to account for that. So this is a pretty robust model if you want to visualize the marginal effects that are estimated from these models. So as you can see, the effects for global reach are far smaller in size, but they're both quite dramatic in terms of their standardized effects. We also do a model where the network measures are lagged. So we collect the network measures at time t, and then the dv at time t+1. As you can see, our models, the effects survive this lagging. This brings us close to a causal model. Again, I'm not gonna die on that hill. The point being that at least this suggests that it operates in the direction wherein as you occupy network position, your strength of identification follows. So now let me show you this in a within-person specification. So here we include individual fixed effects, and the idea here is holding fixed differences between individuals insofar as they relate to their strength of identification constant. So explaining away personality traits that makes one person a Groucho Marx and the other a strong identifier. Do we still see a relationship between the position they occupy in the network and their strength of identification? And the answer is yes. As you can see, the effects are obviously now smaller in size. There's a lot of variation in strength of identification that is explained by fixed differences because some people are cynics who don't identify and others are strong identifiers. But still, above and beyond that, the effects are additive. We can't, for example, include gender here because we have individual fixed effects. And if you want to see the visualization of the marginal effects, they're smaller in magnitude. but they're still quite sizable, and as you can see, very significant in their effects. So somebody who moves from -2 to +2 standard deviations in their local clustering moves roughly 1 standard deviation in their strength of identification. So at the extreme, the range of identification strength that is being covered is quite sizable here. So not only are the effects significant, they're actually quite sizable. Definitely, from my experience in computational social science, these kinds of effects tend to be smaller when you collect them from such noisy measures such as network exchange, email exchange, and language. When we lag the models, only local clustering survives our lagging, but this is a very, very conservative specification. We also lose some of the observations because this is done at the quarter level. But unfortunately, we can't show you that this survives at the global reach level. So that is those are really the results I wanted to show you. Before I open this up to Q&A, I'll just say that Lara has adapted these measures to think about other problems related to network kind of position and network outcomes and identity similarity and identification. So she used the same kind of approach and using kind of fine-tuning, using mittens models to individual speakers, but rather than using it to measure identification, to measure their identity similarity. So the female and male kind of stereotypically represented here the models are going to be fine-tuned to their individual speech, and we're going to look at the distance and embedding space between their eyes, their use of the first-person pronoun. The closer they are in space, the more Lara is assuming that they define themselves in similar ways. And what she shows is that her measure of identity similarity is both related to the probability of them having a tie, having a relationship in the organization, and the intensity of the organization. So she kind of flips the model here in terms of the direction. She shows how using this strategy kind of helps predict who's going to have relationships and whose relationships are going to be strong in the organization. I don't want to get so much into the details of this study, and I definitely don't want to steal her thunder, but the idea here is to show you that this kind of paradigm that we've created can be used not only to measure the strength of identification, but also to measure identification more broadly as a sociological problem inside organizations. Yes, Eric, I see your hand raised there.
I think some other people, Tony and someone else, had indicated before me that they had questions.
Go ahead.
But we are not yet at Q&A. Do you want to finish the conclusion and everyone can then ask?
So you know what? Let me just conclude with my bombastic inferences, and then we can open up to this conversation. So hopefully I persuaded you that we developed a time-varying measure of organizational identification, leveraging these fine-tuned word embedding models, which to my knowledge have not really been used, definitely not in the sociological literature. We provide empirical support for what I think is a kind of long-standing sociological theory and intuition about the relationship between network position and identification, but that hitherto has rarely been, in fact, has not been empirically demonstrated, definitely not in organizational contexts. We also show you that identification requires not only local clustering, but global integration. I think that's especially pertinent to organizational life. And here are going to be some of my more speculative comments. We believe that our results extend beyond organizations because, as I started, identification is not just a problem in an organizational setting, it's more broadly a sociological problem. It can be applied to other contexts, from partisan politics to armed conflict. So, for example, I'm intrigued. My wife is a military historian, so I've always been intrigued in war, in kind of war. I would be interested in seeing whether, for example, applying our approach to analyzing letters that soldiers sent from the front would be related to their sense of patriotism and maybe to their willingness to sacrifice themselves in battle. Maybe that's far-fetched, but I believe this can be approached. Of course, there are some caveats on contexts where this should or shouldn't apply, but I think that broadly speaking, we should expect to find a relationship between network position and sense of identification, whether that is the organization, the nation, your religious denomination, your occupational identity, etc. I believe that these effects should generalize across contexts. So thank you very much for listening, and I want to thank Lara again for spearheading this project, and I'm excited to hear questions and comments. Oh, I see now that the chat was so why don't you manage the Q&A, Siki, so that you've taken better note of who asked first.
Well, we can just follow the order. First one is Tony.
Okay, thank you, Emma. You deliver what I expected to be exciting and provocative talk. I want to make a brief comment, follow-up comment on our earlier Q&A, and then a question. The follow-up comment is, I can see the wisdom you claimed earlier, the approach of not specifying more in the model in training data. I see the end result being so sharp and interpretable that this is a wise move. But I just want to qualify that it doesn't take away the wisdom of doing both.
Yeah.
Doing your approach and also the approach that assumes more. And see, this model, despite not making those assumptions, we can still give that kind of deliver that kind of delivery. That would be solving all the questions. And then my question is, I can't help but ask the question, how would you relate your work and your approach to Harrison White's work? Harrison just passed away. It's one of the most influential thought leaders in social network and identity research from a network perspective. The late Harrison White emphasized also the relationship between network and identity. In particular, emphasizing how identity is not a fixed concept, but dynamically related to constantly changing relationships and interaction, which deliver a difficult and at the same time inspiring approach to looking at identity and network. And you are talking almost about the same kind of general area, but using a quite different perspective and totally different technology. So I wonder, if you are speaking for Harrison, what would you have said going next step from what you have just done?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So first of all, I can't be so presumptuous as to say that I'm speaking for Harrison White. I had the pleasure of meeting him in Columbia. So when I was applying for PhDs, I did my PhD at Princeton, but I also got admitted to Columbia, and I met him there. He was already at the end of his career. I understand that he was sick, but I came across the news that he passed away recently, and he's definitely he's if anyone kind of single-handedly created the network science and sociology, it would be attributed to Harrison White. So, the answer to this question is, on the one hand, I have to admit that I read Network Identity and Control several times, and it's a very difficult book to understand. It's very difficult. But I would hope that if Harrison were here, and I did present this paper last year at Columbia Sociology, he would be excited that this is an attempt to operationalize his foundational intuitions. I think roughly he talked about his famous paper around cat nets, the idea that the network and the category are co-constitutive. Scott Boorman wrote about the duality of persons and groups. So neither of them at that time used the terminology identity, but here I think the category is an identity implied. The group is an identity. And the intuition is that the two are mutually constitutive. Also, hence the impossibility of like solving the causality problem, because mutual constitution suggests that there's dual causality operating all the time. I think, I don't know, my hope is that a Whitean observer here would say, wow, this is precisely the kind of vision that Harrison White had, but didn't have the technology to implement. That would be a big compliment for my perspective in evaluating our work.
Very good. Thank you for sharing your thought.
And next is Jamie.
Hey, Amir. Hopefully, you remember me. We emailed by email about your associative division paper before and discussed like potential collaboration. Yeah. So, but this is like fantastic work. As your other papers have inspired me so much. So one question that I have is, I wish I could hear more about where global reach comes from. Because it seems like you are arguing that like individuals integrated globally tend to have like stronger identification with their organization. But I also believe that email network is like primarily work-based, and the company works around like sub-departments or teams, right? So I assume like the Leuven communities that you detected largely correspond to the departments in a company. Then the effects you found for like global integration, I think maybe it's a function of the roles and departments and less like individuals outreach. So I know that you use like 50 effects and other things, but I think I'm pointing to potential like measurement errors, right? Then if there's like such a measurement error, then the story might go like task or department's characteristics one belongs to, and it's supposed to accomplish is critical to organization identification. So is that like your argument or something? So you could speak about yeah.
So there are two ways to think about your question. One is just thinking about it kind of what is the best way to measure this? But the more profound question is kind of what is the theoretical intuition, which I kind of sensed was how you started it. So of course departments structure the network, but Crackart and others have demonstrated to us that the two are not one of the same, and oftentimes in many organizations people have cross-departmental connections, and some organizations even the two. So for example, in the consultancy firm that we had, it's kind of a kind of international staffing firm, there actually people don't operate in departments so much, they operate in projects, and there's a lot of like cross-cutting ties. So what we didn't want to reify the departments, we wanted to take an inductive approach that really kind of looks at what is the structure, the real experience structure. That would be my preferred approach from an empirical perspective. But from a theoretical perspective, I think what happens in an organization is if you are part of a fairly kind of small area in the organization and you interact with people all the time, and then there's a town hall meeting, and you go to that town hall meeting and you don't know anybody except your colleagues, or there's some event, sometimes it happens to me. I go to places and I meet people from Stanford and I'm kind of embarrassed not to know them, So the point is that the idea of global reach is that you have these connections that extend above and beyond the simple opportunity for you to interact with people simply because they are part of your dense kind of network. And our argument is that that induces a sense of identification because first to take a very kind of BERT approach, you're exposed to information about what happens in parts of the organizations that you're not embedded in. So I happen to be married to an historian at Stanford, so I hear a lot about what happens in the history department. But I also hear, I have friends in chemistry, I have friends, and I hear about things that are not relevant to what happens to my day-to-day life, but it gives me a far more richer sense of the life of Stanford as an organization, and my kind of anecdotal experiences that makes me feel more part of the organization. So I think it's both of these things. It's the information that you were exposed to, but also simply the subjective sense that if you were to sample randomly somebody from the organization, there is some chance that you actually know that person. And to analogize this to let's say life in identification with a nation. So think about a very multicultural, multi-ethnic society like America. So if maybe, I don't know, but the implication would be that maybe we all know that there's a lot of like ethnic homophily in the United States, okay? African Americans then have friends with African Americans, Asians with Asians, etc. But imagine that you're an Asian, and imagine that that would be like the structure of community. But you also have cross-community relationships. You also know a lot of people who are Muslims or Catholic whites, etc. The implication would be that makes you feel like you're more strongly embedded in America and in the broad multicultural sense, and that would increase your identification. I don't, this is speculative, but that would be kind of the implication. So I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
And then Eric.
Okay, so I'll make a couple of quick unrelated comments and feel free to ignore or respond to whichever ones you feel like. First is just maybe kind of, I may be kind of missing the point. So in terms of these, the network links, I got how you described that, but it struck me that I'm wondering to what extent that you're looking on the one hand, network strength, right? Position within a network, but that may be directly related to hierarchy within the network. The higher I am within the network, the more likely I am to have a certain type of network structure around me. And is that something that you're controlling for or something, you probably addressed that, but I'm not quite getting that.
Okay.
And another comment is, again, quite unrelated, but since you had mentioned sort of the history of things a couple of times, that sort of induces me to make this comment about Shelby Foote. He's a Civil War. He passed away quite a while ago, but he was a very noted Civil War scholar and also a writer of fiction. And he was featured very much on these Ken Burns Civil War documentaries. And so I've been watching a number of interviews with him just because I found him very, very interesting to listen to. And he was asked at one point, well, had you been alive at that time, would you have taken up arms for the South? Because Shelby Foote was from Greenville, Mississippi initially, and very much of the South. But he felt that they were very misguided. But so he was asked, would you have taken up arms? And he said, well, yes, I would have. And why? He said, well, because they're my people. And so it seems that very much sort of is in line with some of the comments that you had made about how identity and this willing to make this sacrifice goes into place. The other thing about the global kind of local thing, and this is somewhat related to the idea about structure, but it's been my observation that just kind of based on casual, observation, that the higher a person is in the organization. So when I worked for Vancouver City Hall, it dawned on me that someone like the city manager or the mayor spent, even though they're very much a part of our organization, City Hall, the more time they would spend talking to people outside City Hall.
Yeah.
And so that would be this kind of global kind of connection, maybe in a different sense than but because they're doing it, they're actually representing our organization to those outside. And so that might be an additional way of kind of explaining why these global linkages would reinforce kind of the local identification, is that by being sort of outside, I'm emphasizing what it is. I'm sort of becoming more aware of what I'm not, and therefore more of what I am, which is part of City Hall, for example. And a very small thing, but I don't know if you did it on purpose, but I was amused by the fact that earlier in the talk, you had an individual represented by I, the small letter I. And then later on, when you were talking about another part of it, you had the individual represented by the small u. I thought, well, was that an accidental choice? I found it amusing that I and you both appeared as placeholders for people. So I'll stop there.
Well, you have a very refined embedding model in learning, looking at our notation and nomenclature. I will leave it ambiguous as to whether this was intentional or serendipity.
Right.
But you raise very good questions. So actually, I'll address them in reverse order. So the previous comment about people who are higher tend to interact with outside stakeholders. That's obviously true. Technically, this is not a problem for us because we only analyze intra-organizational communication. We exclude even our agreements with the firms is that we will never analyze communication with people who are not members of the organization. So our models are never estimated by external communication. But I think you're right. This is like your iteration is correct. It's a different way of thinking about global reach. But here, this is global reach that extends beyond the boundary of the organization, and it reinforces. I think that's kind of a complement to our theoretical apparatus. I don't think it is antithetical or inconsistent with it. Your comment about Shelby Foote, very interesting. And now I'm a bit hesitant because when we talk about the ultimate sacrifice, I think like we want to be careful about. There's a difference between sacrificing your after-hour time and sacrificing your life, of course. And I think, why would Shelby Foote say, well, they're my people? I mean, when the sense is that it's an existential threat, people always go back to their, as someone who grew up in Israel, believe me, I understand that comment very well, despite my strong sense of discomfort with everything that's happening on multiple sides, I think it's an interesting question. People are willing to sacrifice. I think that in many cases, it does translate to a sense of self. If you're strongly attached to the organization, if you feel that the organization is under threat of bankruptcy or like of not surviving, you're willing to sacrifice yourself, not in the fatalist sense of the word, but definitely in the time sense. And I'm pretty sure there's evidence to suggest that this is related with your strength of identification. But all of that said, I also want to kind of put some dampers on my analogy to warfare. I think there's a lot of a lot of contingencies that one needs to introduce into the theory when you think about warfare. Finally, I think your most pertinent question with respect to our operationalization is really around the question of hierarchy. I agree with you. So technically speaking, yes, we have addressed this. We account for people's role when you include fixed effects. People during most of our window of observation are not promoted into a managerial position. We did our modeling where we exclude all people who occupy managerial positions. So to account for the fact that also people use different language when they talk to their managers. But in many ways, the fact that the position that you occupy in the hierarchy affects your network position is a feature, is not a bug of our theory. It's kind of a way by which organizational life induces a network position on you. And to the extent that that inducement then produces identification, then that should be born in our data. So, but, you know, we account for managerial. That's the way that we can address hierarchy. So I'm not concerned that this is driven solely by hierarchy, but I think you raise very good points. I see that Tony
Yeah,
has.
we have time for one last question for Tony's follow-up question.
Yeah, thank you for this final opportunity. I meant to raise it as a question as well as a suggestion. So your answer may be just yes, and then I look forward to seeing the consequence. The question is, can you approach operationalize the measurement of multiple identities, which using your spatial embedding approach to embedding identity in a semantic space, which has lots of virtues you already mentioned earlier on, it will solve a theoretical difficulty in Harrison White's earlier theory.
Yeah.
He has used to be very clear-minded, projecting an image, a promise, and the consequence of clearly measuring difficult sociological concepts using simple network models, operating well-defined, very sharp. Later on, when he started talking about identity, people got into difficulty because you cannot at the same time measuring identity with network and using network to predict, to explain identity. But now you provided a new approach to measuring identity, which appears to me, given your data in this example, should be able to measure multiple identities as people simultaneously exist in different clusters, different network local clusters, and also dynamically changing over time. Seems to have the capability to demonstrate the feasibility of this approach to further explore and test theoretical predictions of Harrison's work. Is this possible? If yes, I look forward to seeing you do that.
The answer is yes, but if especially we're thinking about multiple identities or identity switching, or how context affects your identity, I would use a similar approach, but that mechanically uses slightly different ways. There are demonstrations showing that Mittens requires fine-tuning the whole model, but you can also Rodriguez and al. Introduced something called the a la carte embedding model, which basically can identify the meaning of a word in a given sentence, as opposed to like estimating it across multiple sentences. So I would use that approach, and it would be interesting to see how people change their identity construals as a function of who they speak to, what the situation is. And that, once again, would very much kind of echo White's theoretical predictions. So I think it's a good suggestion. Yeah.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing new results from you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your time. It was a pleasure. What time is it for you guys? It's early morning, no?
Yeah.
It's about 11 a.m.
Oh, okay. So it's time for coffee.
Yeah, thank you again so much for joining us today and sharing your intriguing research with us. And,
thank you for inviting.
Have a good rest of your day.
Same to you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
See you again.